but like I said, I've been in the industry for about 35 years. I actually realized in listening to some of the comments and questions today, particularly from Kurt, that actually there's some benefits, pros and cons about no longer being in crypto and being in cannabis today. I realize on the pros side, there's I'm no longer have to explain about FTX. I don't get questions about FTX, for which I have to come up with thoughtful answers. But people always ask, my thoughts on the space. I thought there were some very provocative and great questions on crypto. I'm going to the dinner tonight, off the record, no skin in the game. Happy to give my own opinion. I was president of Pantera Capital a few years back. And on the other bad side about cannabis, I've had to endure all the jokes from the potential investors on whether or not Silver Spike is going to provide, some free samples from the investors that invest in us. I had to endure all that. If I think I had $1 for every time people asked that, I think Silver Spike would have all the AUM we required to deploy.
You don't have to buy cannabis anymore. You just walk down the street and
well, you certainly can smell it. That's for sure. Look, I was thinking about my comments today. I think this is super important. So, a hedge fund manager, a very famous one, which I used to work with many years ago, he was sort of being provocative, and he said, "Look, Bill, it's super easy. 90% of getting a trade right is getting the macro call right. Right? The other 10% is security selection." And I think that's really the case in cannabis today. And I think there's been I think people have confused the value proposition in cannabis in terms of senior secure credit versus equity. Sometimes hitting doubles all the time, you can still go to the Hall of Fame. And I think the 3 points I really want to convey today I would like to convey 3 points that are takeaways today. Number one, the macro thesis, or I should say the secular underpinnings of the legal cannabis industry are very strong.
Hold on really quick. Just because I've been in cannabis for about 20 years legally, numerous businesses. Are you talking about, when you say that statement, adult use or medical?
Well, that's why I said legal. So the question was, when I talk about the secular themes in cannabis, what I'm referring to is the growth of the legal cannabis industry, right? That's medical. There's 37, 39 states that have medical and what people call adult use.
Yeah.
My point is that 2 or 3 years people asked, could the federal government go back on this if a Republican administration could come in, or Democratic, what's the scoop here? I think the genie is out of the bottle. The genie's not going back in the bottle, right? The states are tripping over themselves to legalize it. I mean, a great barroom conversation and factoid is stating that the state of Massachusetts raises more tax revenue in cannabis than they do in alcohol, right? It's creating jobs, it's creating revenues. There aren't a lot of senators that are going to really go back to their constituents and sort of, tank cannabis. Now, the reasons why it hasn't become federally legal, that's a different conversation. The main point I want to convey to you is that the macro tailwinds are super strong. The second point I want to, in terms of like a 15% CAGR, to put context to it,
there's been a lot of consolidation. I mean, certain states like Oregon, there's oversupply, even in Oregon, California. I mean, so it's not a totally rosy picture. If you look at the public markets, those stocks tank. I mean, look, we are in cannabis. I'm not saying we're not, but I would not paint as such a rosy picture. Yes, from a regulatory perspective, you're right, but from a business perspective, there's a lot of companies in trouble.
Yeah, so in case somebody can't listen or hear, there's a distinction someone is making about either the business rollout, the development of the industry, the supply-demand imbalances. I don't mean to convey that it is the same, but I am making a very important point, and that is that usage of legal cannabis in 10 years' time will be fundamentally greater than it is today. And just to give it context, $100 billion consumer market could be one of the largest consumer markets in the United States. I'm not suggesting it's going to be a nice, easy road to get there, but I do believe that there'll be very, very profitable opportunities to lend to this. But I just want to make sure that people have an appreciation of that the macro thesis is very strong, with a lot of warts. I'm not suggesting that there aren't a lot of warts. The second point I'm trying to make, which gets to your point, that this is a very inefficient market, right? And there are two really fundamental drivers. Number one, to your point,
and not easy to scale.
Absolutely, and not easy to scale. My favorite guest is already suggesting. But the legal cannabis is very complex. It's heavily regulated. People are somewhat surprised to know that it's as heavily regulated as it is. And you know, there are a lot of limited license states. There's sometimes requirements to be vertically integrated. It's a very complex, fragmented market. I think people in the asset management industry and investors in general believe that the lack of federal legalization or the fact that banks can't lend is the competitive moats. I think it goes beyond that. I think it's a very fragmented, specialized industry that creates a lot of competitive moats. I think the second point I want to make within this complexity is that the traditional sources of capital just aren't available, right? I was at Deutsche for 18 years. I know many of the largest credit asset shops, they don't want to touch it, right? They've got a $50 billion franchise, even getting one of them maybe to do it on their family office. I mean, the guy really wanted to do it. He thought that the value proposition was obvious. They just didn't want to swing it. So, but people, again, mistakenly think that banks can't provide services to cannabis. In the latest Treasury report, 511 federally chartered banks actually are providing banking services. But the main point here is that there's a lack of traditional sources of capital, either from traditional asset managers or banks, right? And that's to the third point, and that's really the punchline, right? From our vantage point, and we've been credit guys for almost 4 decades, we think the senior secured credit cannabis opportunity affords you probably the highest non-distressed credit opportunity that we see today, right? It's in the high teens, senior secured, first lien, very leverage friendly to the lenders, covenant, very rigorous covenant packages. And I think when I was listening earlier today to the asset management panel, when they talk about new strategies, uncorrelated niche markets, it's not a heavily trafficked space. Like in the old biblical saying, in the land of the blind, one-eyed man is king, right? There's a huge opportunity here to service, you know, this opportunity.
Is it real estate? Is it the
Yeah, so the question, which I'd love to get to in 1 second, let me just briefly introduce Silver Spike. Then the question was, what type of collateral are we lending against? But Silver Spike, very briefly, we're an SEC registered private credit manager. We've raised about $1 billion in the private equity markets over the past 4 years, including the only SEC registered NASDAQ listed BDC, a business development corporation. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, it's actually the only 40 Act fund where, you know, Joe Public can go out and get access to. We're deploying capital since last summer in that, and it was actually a blind pool IPO. I think the first one since Apollo in 2003 for a BDC, and we're led by Scott Gordon, who I worked with 30 years ago in emerging markets. He's worked at JP Morgan, Caxton, Marathon, all the credentials, B of A distressed, and was a president of a $7 billion single family office. But most importantly, I think he actually was the chairman of the board and a primary investor in one of the most popular brands. My friend over there knows a lot about cannabis. Perhaps he's heard about Papa and Barkley in California, one of the most widely known brands in the industry. Started that business from scratch, so had a real bird's eye seat on the domain expertise. And then last but not least, we're emerging market guys. We have all the emotional scars from our experience of lending to pretty dicey areas. But we think that there's a lot of real similarities to the earliest days of emerging market debt and the cannabis industry around capital formation, legal ambiguity, and that's the story about Silver Spike Capital. We really just want to be the blue chip fiduciary in the space and bring a bit of credentialization, whether it's through our BDC, our own backgrounds, and really destigmatize the asset class and offer this to people like yourselves. We want to be just good partners, right? We feel we can bring all of our expertise to bear. The question, I'll go straight to it. I think a lot of people here sort of have a view of the macro and the micro about cannabis. So what do I talk about senior secured credit? And I'll get to the collateral question. We're making senior secured credit, first lien, oftentimes 2 times leverage at about 30% loan to value. You can compare that to the traditional direct lending space of around 5 times levered, 50 to 75% loan to value. And it's very, unlike many of the traditional direct lendings, which tend to be somewhat covenant light, we're very, very heavy covenant. We can block their bank accounts, for example, if they're in default. And actually, on a transaction we just funded 2 weeks ago, MaryMed, we did the transaction with another lender in the industry with whom we, from time to time syndicate with. The CFO had been in the industry for 25 years, her first year in cannabis. And she's actually, I'm surprised she said it publicly. She said, I've never seen these types of terms before as a borrower. This is nuts. But effectively, I think that goes to the point of what we're doing. I can talk about the underwriting process in a second, but in terms of the collateral, we're lending, the types of companies we're lending to are, really good management teams, develop brands, primarily vertically integrated operators, i.e. there's cultivation, there's manufacturing, there's distribution, logistic assets. And when we're lending to these borrowers, we're effectively, one of the things we like to say in terms of our BDC, we can do everything a REIT can do and everything a REIT can't do. So we can take collateral on anything that moves. We can take collateral to many of their franchise contracts that they have for the brands that are expanding out through the United States. And oftentimes we'll look at the assets from a alternative use, right? So if it's a cultivation, and by the way, we don't like the bookends. We wouldn't never say never, but we're not going to just lend to someone who's simply cultivating. But we'll look at that asset and determine whether or not they could grow strawberries there, if that be the case. If they have a dispensary, could that storefront go to Best Buy? But at the end of the day, we're looking at assets. We work with third-party consultants when we do the analysis ourselves, either at the cultivation facility, at the manufacturing facility. There's some very interesting marginal. People might be surprised at some of the marginal or lack of marginal benefits if you start increasing the canopy of your grow. So we really get very deep. And we take collateral in almost everything that that we lend against. Again, at much more conservative levels than perhaps in the traditional direct lending space. That sort of answered the collateral question. Yeah,
and that also include for seeds as well too.
I beg your pardon?
For seeds, you collateralize seeds as well too. You have these seed banks that are becoming more and more popular. A lot of people want to talk about like how CERN, they're fully integrated. They might have over 300 different genetic strains, with different competitors, and that's something that's come up over the last year. So we say, about anything, are you also doing anything their seed bank at all?
Yeah. So the question is regarding whether we take collateral in terms of the seed banks, as they say, where there's some of these new strains. I mean, we're good old curmudgeon cash flow lenders, right? So if we can get that into the collateral pool and assess what we think is a reasonable value of collateral against that, we'll do that. But I want to underscore, we're cash flow lenders, right? So to the extent that's part of the collateral pool, we'll do it.
So is it just a cash coupon? Is cash making warrants?
Yeah, good question on whether it's just cash, the level of coupons, and whether warrants. Our BDC does not take warrants. So one of the areas that got it past the SEC was that we won't take any equity interest. But our fund that we're raising now, which I neglected to mention in terms of our investment opportunities, you can do a Silver Spike today. I'll talk about that in a second. We can't take warrants, but the coupons tend to be in the 12, 13, 14%. But when you take into account fees, OID, we're talking about yields today in the 16 to 18%, right? I think from our standpoint, we don't want to. This is unlevered. So the question is levered versus unlevered. It's a great question. The assets that we're generating are at 16 to 18%. Many of you that know the direct lending market, they're underwriting loans at much less yields and throwing a bunch of fund leverage on top of that. But I want to make something perfectly clear that we think is a very interesting distinction. We'd much rather lend to what we think is a very good credit at 17 or 18% with no warrants, rather than try to take a significantly lower coupon and make an equity bet, right? We just want to get paid back. And I think this is one of the, where people conflate the equity story. One of the earlier questions was, yeah, you know, it's really bad, the profitability, the public markets. Well, we're not, I think that people have sort of taken hook, line, and sinker a little bit on the Wall Street analyst view of this rapid growth of the MSO public names. You know, we're not trying to bet on the next unicorn in the cannabis space. We just want to get paid back, right? So, and in terms, yes.
I was going to ask you, if a company is offering a building as collateral, you go with a larger loan, you go like a traditional lender?
Right. So the question is sort of the REIT model in terms of lending against the building. Perhaps they'll lend against the improvements on the building, which the REITs tend to do. You know, we will take buildings as collateral, but again, along the same lines as I mentioned before, we're going to evaluate the entire collateral package.
Right.
That gets us to that two times.
Can they get a larger financing package with the real estate?
Oh, the question is whether they can do a larger. Yeah, I think that's a great question. Whether they can get. I mean, ultimately, we're not a REIT. We're not in the REIT lending model in the sense that they're really looking primarily to the real estate asset, right? So they'll $100 million valuation. I don't know. Perhaps maybe the building was storing ping pong balls, had a $10 million valuation. Now it's storing cannabis. They're going to put a $30 million valuation on it, put some put some improvement on it, and lend $40 million against that asset. That's not our model. That's not our model. Again, we'll take collateral on a full package, and I think that ultimately, I think what the lenders and the REITs are finding that perhaps some of these some of these real estate only assets to lend against are becoming more and more limited. We're lending to brands as well as just a single operator.
So if he's bringing a building, you're looking at the building asset plus the cash flow?
Well, we're always looking at cash flow.
Right.
Like we sit down with the company, look at projections. It's all about cash flow, right? If a building is part of the pool, we'll assign our own collateral value to it, but we're not predicated on the REIT model for advancing against a particular collateral.
But you'll use projections for their ability to service the debt.
Absolutely, yeah. So we're the 5 partners at Silver Spike Capital have all been in the industry between 20 to 35 years across special situations, distressed, credit. This is it's sort of a dichotomy. We're bringing an old time tested capability and skill set to a new industry, right? With our own domain expertise. I just want to make one thing I forgot to mention at the beginning, to level set the opportunities for us at Silver Spike Capital. You can certainly go out and buy our BDC if you want. We have, sorry, this ticker for the BDC is SSIC. We haven't declared a dividend yet. We're about 70% in terms of deploying the capital. The second opportunity is you could co-invest. Our BDC recently signed a $1 billion charitable trust that chose to do its first cannabis transaction alongside us. So for family offices that may not want to invest in a fund and want to look for $5 million investments or more, we have an $800 million pipeline at Silver Spike Capital that we think is very investable. And the third opportunity, other than the BDC or the co-invest, is a GPLP fund that we're raising, 2-year capital call, 4-year harvest. We think we can get the capital out very quickly, targeting 8 to 10% quarterly distributions, and at final IRRs somewhere around the 12%. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the default side of the story? What the source of issues would be, and also, is there any sort of systemic risk over time? I asked that in light of Wall Street Journal article this morning about just the untenable economics of the legal cannabis industry that involve with taxes and regulations. I assume if you're in this business, you're not worried about that, but is there an argument that could create problems for you?
Right. The first question was
loss.
That was a long
Loss
answer.
ratio.
Yeah. So the 2 questions. First on his sort of losses and historic loss track record, and then a systemic question. It's still a very early industry, right? So there are not a lot of historical track record in terms, and I think you're going to start seeing that cycle. I think over the next couple of years, you're going to start seeing who the good underwriters were. I think there could be, some problem loans out there. But I think it's still early days in terms of, that credit cycle first coming through. I think the history of the credit business in the cannabis space was, sort of equipment leasing, and then REITs, and then you're seeing now new funds come to fruition. So it's pretty tough. There is no real track record, which is why I think it's pretty important to look at the underlying underwriting teams in terms of their track record, their experience, their domain expertise, but most importantly, have they been around through a few interest rate cycles and market cycles? In terms of the systemic risk, I think it goes back to the question was whether that there's a real economic model for profitable. Again, I think people are conflating big, large MSOs that aren't allowed to scale their businesses in other states. For those that may not be familiar with a MSO, oftentimes when they get a vertically integrated license, the state requires them to do everything in state, and there's no interstate commerce that's allowed, right? I think those models are challenged. And clearly the models in cannabis are challenged also by the 280E tax, which doesn't allow cannabis operators to deduct much of their SGA related type expenses. So I think, again, this is why you can get 16 to 18% senior secured first lien loans, right? So if it was that easy, all the asset managers and banks would be involved. So, but I do think that this risk, there are a lot of profitable companies out there. There are a lot of private, well-managed brands in California. There's some people don't even want to go to a competitive market, and we would rather lend to a management team that's been in knife fights all day long, building a profitable business, than sort of being somewhat immune in a limited license
Well,
state.
another twist on it, what are the terms?
Time
on the
for one
loans?
last question.
What are the terms, the lives of the loans?
Oh, good question. The question was the terms of the types of loans we're making. So they tend to be 4 years, floating, and at least the types of stuff that Silver Spike is doing, there's already an embedded amortization schedule. So we're sort of de-risking the asset. But like many people know, in traditional direct lending, there's quite a bit of prepayment. But this is about as good as you can get. 2 times levered, 30% LTV, floating, amortization schedule, prepayment penalties, all the types of things that you would imagine in a lender friendly environment.
Fantastic.